Hey, so we're going to turn now from our study of Plato to the study of Aristotle. And depending on your attitude, that can either be a drag or a relief. Um, well, I mean, on the one hand, it's great just because Aristotle is great, but the actual experience of reading Aristotle is quite different from the experience of reading Plato. Plato writes in this very literary, poetic kind of way, and reading it's kind of like reading a story, and so that in that sense, it's easy. Well, reading Aristotle is not like that. Reading Aristotle is like reading a philosophy textbook or a philosophy essay. So it can be a drag if you were having fun reading a story and now you have to go read dry arguments, or it can be a relief if you thought that reading Plato was kind of hard work because you're always trying to figure out, like, okay, but what's the point here? What should I believe? And then you read Aristotle, and Aristotle just tells you what it means. Um, but the overall philosophical orientation is very similar. The issues we're going to talk about are very similar. But Aristotle's going to take things up in a little bit of a different way, and we're going to bring different things out of our reflections on those topics. But you should feel like you're still living in the same world, and indeed, you're really living in the same world that we began with at the very beginning. Not the very first text we read, but very early on, we read the second course of Sophocles' Antigone. And there, we looked at what they said about Tadena, the wonders, and we were talking about nature, and then looking at the distinctive character of the human being and the relationship of the human being to nature, and that has been our guiding theme. Like that's that question of the human being that we launched there, we really carried forward through our study of the Apology and the Republic. And that sat in the context of thinking about nature, although there our focus really was on what is this human world. That's what we were really getting at in Plato. In Aristotle, we're going to continue that same thing. We're going to continue to think about the nature of the human being, but we're going to think about the nature of the human being in its context in nature. And um, and so in that sense, it's going to continue exactly what we did with the second course. And indeed, let me just say one more thing about that. That second course of Antigone really is a kind of blueprint for this classical ancient Greek philosophy. So we've studied a lot of things over the last few weeks, deep and profound things, complicated things, very serious things, very rich things. But if you go back after having studied the Plato and indeed the Aristotle, and you go back to that second course, in a way, you can see that all of these things we've been studying are just kind of workings out of the basic perspective on reality that was articulated there. So there's an awful lot to be got from sitting with that poetic text and just thinking through it. And all these studies we've done of Plato and now of Aristotle are in a way giving you the tools to think about that text and to bring something powerful out of it. Anyway, so as I said, with Aristotle, we're going to continue that basic study, and we're going to begin by thinking about nature. So the first thing we're going to read, let me say about what we're going to read. Our focus is mostly going to be on two works. It's going to be on his work on the soul, which you will often hear about under its Latin name, De Anima, and we're going to then especially look at his work, the Nicomachean Ethics. But we're going to begin with a short look at his work, the Physics. So let me say a little bit about that. You see the title Physics, and it reminds you of your high school class or your university class where you were studying Newton, and those sorts of things. The topic is the same, but it looks very different. Why is the topic the same? Well, because physics is just from the Greek word physis, which means nature. So the study of physics literally is just the study of nature. What we're going to study in Aristotle, though, when we're doing physics, is pretty different from what you would study when you study Newton or when you take your high school or university physics class. It's not different because those things are about different topics. It's different because they're built around a significantly different interpretation of what nature is. The thing you study now in physics class has its roots in early modern Europe. It has its roots in the thing we call the scientific revolution. And that revolution was basically built around an interpretation of it as something that was open to manipulation by human beings, right? If we could figure out the sort of rules nature works by, we can figure out how to get in there and make it do what we want. And that's what you really study now when you study things like physics. But that's not the interpretation that Aristotle has. Aristotle and the Greeks fundamentally understand nature to be the world of life. So the physics of someone like Newton is not a study of a living thing. It's a or of a domain of life even. It's a study of matter and energy. Right? It's a study of this world of living things, in a situation where you ignore the fact that there are living things and try to figure out, like, what are the root things that will make this stuff, move, that I can manipulate. But the Greek philosophical approach to nature is an attempt to recognize, like, how does nature present itself, and what is that? What is life? That's so. When Aristotle is studying physics, that's really what he's asking. Roughly, it's a slight variant on that, which I'll explain in a bit, but that's roughly what he's asking. And so, in that way, broadly speaking, the study of physics in Aristotle resembles more what you would associate with biology than what you would associate with physics, in that sense that it's taking its orientation from the forms of things that live and grow more so than it's taking its orientation from the elementary matters of matter and energy and how they move around. That said, Aristotle's physics studies those things too, but even there, his orientation is quite different, because the very way he construes movement is not like a mechanical thing of one thing getting pushed from one place to another, but movement is something he understands much more like life. It's much more the way something is carrying out its own natural kind of trajectory. So those are just a few orienting words, just to sort of get you into the context. But now let's actually start that. Let's look a little bit at the beginning of Book 2 of the physics, Book 2, Chapter 1. We're only going to scratch the surface of the physics. But the beginning of Book 2 says most effectively exactly what he means by nature, the domain of physics, the domain of what we study in physics. And he says, of things that exist, some exist by nature, some from other causes. Right? So what does nature really mean? He says we're going to think about things that exist by nature, things that exist naturally. Right? So he's saying, what does that mean for something to be natural? He says, by nature, the animals and their parts exist. Right? So living animals exist by nature; they're natural beings, and the parts of animals exist by nature. Right? That's animals naturally produce, elbows and wrists and claws and so on. So by nature, the animals and their parts exist, and the plants and the simple bodies, the air, water, those things that are themselves not living things. They're not organisms, but they are these naturally occurring sort of basic materials of our world. And and that should remind you again of the second course, right? They plowed the earth. They found animals that live in the sea. There were the birds that were flying in the air. Like, they sort of marked out the kind of elements. The horses are in their element when they're on the earth. Fish are in their element when they're in their water, right? Element means something like the natural environment, the natural context, right? And the natural elements are, in the world of nature, is things like the earth, the water, the air. Anyway, so he says, for we say that these are, and things like them exist by nature. And so then he says, okay, what are we saying about them when we say they exist by nature? Well, he says all of the things just mentioned present a feature in which they differ from things that are not constituted by nature. So what are things that are not constituted by nature? Well, they're things that we call them artificial, right? Things that are made, right? But how do these things differ from things that are not constituted by nature? Well, each of them has within itself a principle of motion and stationariness, rest. And that can be motion and rest in respect to place, motion in respect to growth and decrease, motion in respect to alteration. But on the other hand, a bed and a coat or anything else of that sort, insofar as it has that designation, bed, coat, whatever, that is to say, insofar as they are products of art, insofar as they are artificial artifacts, they have no innate impulse to change. Right? So natural things have within themselves a principle of motion and rest. Coats have no principle of motion or rest. So he says a little bit farther on, nature is a source or cause of being moved and of being at rest in that to which it belongs primarily. So that's the basic way he's describing nature. Nature is things that move themselves. Right? So, I can pick up this book and I had to move it. But when I was moving my hand to move the book, that wasn't like that. There was no other. So I could do that. I could grab my hand and make it move. I could do this, right? But then this hand is moving by itself. The world of nature, what it means for something to be natural, right? The world of nature is the world of things that have within themselves their own principle of motion, things that move themselves. So there, I was making a motion with respect to place. I was able to use my hand and I can move it from here to here. But there are kinds of motions that aren't just about motion with respect to place. I, or an animal, or a plant all grow. And that, I guess things do get into different locations, but that's not really movement with respect to place in the same way. That is the thing itself increasing its quantity. But that growth is a kind of motion, and things grow for their own reasons. They don't grow because something is pushing them. They have in themselves a principle of growth, and that's what we would call life. Right? Or, sometimes chameleon skin changes color. That's a kind of motion. It moved. It went from here to here. It may be responsive to an environment, but it's doing it for internal reasons, and that's why it's a chameleon does it and something else doesn't. Right? All of these things, all of these natural beings, we call them natural precisely because the things that define them essentially happen on their own. Whereas a bed and a coat and things like that are the names of things we've made. Right? So with things like a bed and a coat, we've taken something we found in the natural world, like a tree, which we cut down and turned into wood, and we made some nails out of something, out of stone or out of metal that we made from stone, or out of wooden nails or whatever, but we somehow put these things together, we made a bed. So there, even though we got the stuff from nature, the form it ended up taking on didn't happen naturally. The tree the wood didn't naturally, the tree didn't naturally turn itself into wood that then turned itself naturally into a bed. On the contrary, those were interventions of human effort that turned a tree into lumber and turned the wood into a bed, right? And so we put a form onto something that we were using as a kind of material, but those are completely alien to each other. There's no, that's not the form of the material. That's a form imposed on the material. But in a tree, something is growing, and that is simultaneously an issue of matter and an issue of form, right? In a sense, you could say the tree is made out of wood, but that's a misleading thing to say. A bed is made out of wood because it's made out of something. And the thing it's made out of is that stuff you extract from a tree. But a tree isn't made out of wood in that sense. You don't go get wood and put it together and make a tree. On the contrary, well, it'd be better to say wood is made out of a tree rather than the tree is made out of wood. But a tree is that stuff that we would call wood if we extracted it from its living context. It is that stuff, but it is that stuff as the very substance and medium of the tree's existence, right? So tree is what that stuff is. So yeah, it's wood, which is our name for the product we would extract from the tree. But insofar as that is a living tree, that stuff we would call wood if we were to extract it is tree. Right? So the thing I'm trying to get at there is that if you think on this notion of kind of form and matter, like we would use in the bed, where we would say the bed is getting a certain stuff that we're going to use as a material or a matter and impose a form on it. If you think of those same kind of relationships of matter and form as they apply in a living thing, it's the matter is the matter of the form, and the form is the form of the matter, right? There aren't two separate things pushed together like there are in the bed. Right? When matter and form are different, when you put a circular shape on a piece of pottery, right, that's evidence that it's artificial. Whereas natural things are materials that give rise to their own form, or forms that materialize themselves. Right? You can't separate the reality that is what it's made out of and what kind of thing it is. So that's what he's talking about nature. Nature is this realm of things that have their own form, have their own reality that they grow into. Right? And that form, like in a way, that form is kind of like a shape. The tree has a visible shape, but it would be truer to think of it as a form of life. Right? There's a whole process that's enacted through a tree, and the tree is there in the what do you call it? The stalk of a tree. What do you call it? Trunk. It's there in the trunk. It's there in the branches. It's there in the leaves. It's there in the seeds that fall off. It's there in the roots. All of those things are the reality of the tree, and those things themselves don't exist as separate pieces. They are all the way a little form of living is enacted. Right? The form of living that is a tree is enacted as the process of a trunk growing up while little shoots of branches come off and gradually get longer, and then leaves come out of them and seeds come out of them, etc., etc., right? The tree is that whole process, right? You can think back to the example of the orange, the cycle of the growth of the orange that I used when we were talking about Book 6 of the divided line of Book 6 of the Republic. I'm trying to bring together really three words. I'm trying to bring together the words motion, form, and matter, right? And you can see that in a natural thing, they're the same thing. The natural thing is a life process, at least in the context of the tree. There's some things that are not alive. We'll get to that in a moment. But just taking the tree as an example, it's a life process. It's a form of life. And so you need to use the word form in the sense that you need to say there's a specific kind of thing being realized here. Right? And that form, that kind of identity it has been guiding. It is the guiding principle of that thing's whole life process. Right? It is going to be a tree from the minute you put that seed in the ground. Right? It's in the very nature of the seed to be on the way to being a full-grown tree. So the form of the thing was there from the start. Right? So you can't really talk about these things without talking about form. You also can't talk about it without talking about matter. Like a tree only exists as what, in another context, we would call wood. Trunk and leaf. Right? That's the matter of a tree. Just like the matter of you is the your forearm and your elbow and your shoulder and your chest and your ears and your hair and all. You only exist as this differentiated but organized and integrated variety of bodily materials, right? Well, a tree's going to be that too. You can't talk about a tree without talking about its material realization, its bodily realization. And you can't talk about it without talking about motion, because it's a process. It's the way the thing went from here, seed, to here, full-grown, mature bush dropping off other seeds. So nature is a thing that has a principle of motion in itself. I hope that basic idea makes enough sense. And you can see that notion of a thing that is in that sense self-moving, or sort of self-moving, self-making, self-generating, self-propelling, is a notion that is also a matter of both form and matter. And in it, the matter is the matter of the form, and the form is the form of the matter. And all of that is contrasted with an artificial thing. Artificial thing does not move. Insofar as it's a bed, it was made. That's a passive designation. It didn't come into being on its own. There's no genesis there. There's no growth. It was made, and it was made by force. It was made by the force of taking something, initially a tree and then wood, and then forcing that wood into a shape that somebody else put upon it for the sake of a function they wanted to realize through it. Right? So in an artificial thing, there is no principle of motion internal to it. And the relationship of form and matter that characterizes that realized thing, the bed or whatever, is completely mutually alienated. There is no reason why that matter should have taken that form, and there is no reason why that form needed to take that matter. And so if you contrast the bed and the tree, then with respect to these three words, motion, form, and matter, you can see a radical difference in each of them. Right? And that's Aristotle's basic answer to what nature is. It's the he says it's those things that have a principle of motion in themselves, and then I've tried to flesh that out in terms of form and matter. I want to jump ahead to something in chapter 3 quickly, and then I'm going to come back to one thing in chapter 1. Just from chapter 3, he says, so we can talk about four, he calls them, idea, people translate it causes, so we say 4 causes of things. 4 things you can turn to try to explain why a thing is the way it is. And he says, so he says, on the first one is the ta ex hu, the out of which, that out of which. The second one is he says the eidos, or the paradigma, which, or the logos of its tati and ani. So I don't know if that doesn't mean much to you. They translate it here, form, archetype, or statement of the essence. It's not that great. None of those words is great. But let's stick with the word form. So the ex hu, the out of which, that's roughly what I was calling matter. What is it, so to speak, made out of? Although in a tree, it's not actually made. But it's, so you are out of, or the out of which for you is arms, shoulder, hips, etc. Right? That's your material, your matter, so to speak. The bed, the out of which of that is wood, but it's not a natural thing. Right? The second one is basically what I was calling form. The word he uses there is eidos, which might more helpfully be translated species, which is just the Latin equivalent of that word, and it's a word we use a lot. But we're sort of saying what kind of thing it is. Oh, it's an oak tree. That's its eidos. It's this particular one, but that's the kind of reality it's realizing. But then, so those are 2 we already had. So number 1 and number 2 at the beginning of chapter 3 are basically the ones we already said, matter and form. Number 3 is, he says, the first cause of change and coming to rest in the thing, the primary source of the change or coming to rest. And number 4, he says, the end, or the for the sake of which. So in the case of a bed, again, it's made by somebody coming there with a hammer, right? But that's not what it is in the tree. In the tree, the things developed out of that tree because in the seed, there was a kind of an impulse, and there's something in that thing which is its nature, which is its living nature, which is the kind of propelling trajectory, the propelling tendency. You could roughly call it desire, except if you're going to talk about desire, you're at least going to talk about an animal or a human. So you can't really talk about desire in a plant so much, but it's something like desire in a tree. That life force that at the time is what leads it to take in these nutrients, turn towards the sun or whatever, right? So again, the point is the motive force. The point is again that the motive force. The point is again that the motive force in a natural thing is internal to it. It is its very living force. Whereas in a natural thing, it's an alien cause that comes in on it. And the fourth one, the ender, for the sake of which, again, in the natural thing, it's because you want to sleep on something comfortable that you make a bed. The end, or the goal, is totally alien to it. Whereas in a tree, it's governed by an end too, but the end is to mature as a tree, to fulfill its life function, which is to become a complete tree. And that typically also means then to produce seeds and reproduce and so on. But so in any natural thing, you can ask basically, what kind of thing is it? What's it made out of? How, what is the desire? What is the tendency that propels it? Where is it going? What is it aiming for? About any natural thing, you can ask those questions. And in each case, those answers are different they're just different facets of the same reality. There's different aspects of looking at what it means to be that thing. Whereas in an artificial thing, all those things fall apart. There's nothing intrinsic to the thing itself that gives rise to any of those things. They're all imposed from without. So that's a quick account of what Aristotle, how he defines nature, having a principle of motion in yourself, and what are often called his 4 causes: the material, the formal, the moving, and the final, or more. Those are terms others people use to describe them. There are other terms people use to describe them that are far worse. So try not to use those. You should refer to them as the material cause, the formal cause, the moving cause, and the final cause. What he actually says is the out of which, the what it was to be, or the what, the first cause of motion, change, motion or rest in the thing, and that for the sake of which. But anyway, we've got those four. That's from chapter 3. And then I just want to read you one more paragraph from chapter 1, and then I'm gonna, that'll be the end of our look at the physics, and then we're going to move on to talking about the soul in the workday Anima. So he says here, back in chapter 1, right around 193a, he says, "What nature is, then?" And the meaning of the terms by nature and according to nature has been stated. That nature exists, it would be absurd to try to prove, for it is obvious that there are many things of this kind, and to prove what is obvious by what is not is the mark of a man who is unable to distinguish what is self-evident from what is not. Very important point there. So yeah, we said what nature is, but it's not really a question whether nature is. Like, the thing we're doing is we're starting from what is manifest to us in our life, whether you want it to be or not. So it's nature is self-evident in the sense that it is the very stuff of the happening of reality. So if somebody said, well, is there such a thing as this? Like, you couldn't go very far with them, because if you can't recognize things growing, then you're not on board with reality yet. So anyway, we might talk more about that point later, but I just wanted to draw your attention to that remark, which seems like a pretty profound one, right? So the question is, where's our investigation going to start? It's going to start from the given reality that we find ourselves totally surrounded by the fact of self-motion, of growth, of life. And indeed, we find ourselves living. That's not something we get to having started somewhere else. That is the given form of things. That's the starting point of things. So you might want to understand that, but it's not really open to doubt. There is no reality happening. There's no experience happening except insofar as that self-motion is happening. So that's where Aristotle starts. So now I just want you to take that basic definition of nature as things that have a principle of motion themselves, and we're going to take that specifically to the domain of living things, and that's where we're going to talk about soul. I guess I should say one more thing about that. There in the world of nature there are things that are not alive, and that is things like the earth, water, the air, and basically Aristotle understands those things more or less on the same model that he understands plants and animals, in the sense that those things, those similarly, even though they're not alive, they're sort of self-occurring forms of reality that still have within themselves their own principles of sort of motion, or their own tendencies to a certain kind of behavior. That might be a better thing to say. Even though they're not things that actually live. And so if you put air underwater, the air goes up, and they tend to separate, right? If you put earth in water, it goes down. Right? These are different kinds of realities that have a tendency to differentiate themselves from each other, and they have their own characteristic ways of behavior. And the point is that the characteristic ways that water behaves are intrinsic to its nature, in the same way that the characteristic way a tree behaves are intrinsic to its nature. It's just that water isn't itself a living thing, and so the specific ways it behaves are not life. And one of the consequences of that is, like, living things are all individuals. One living tree, another living tree, another living tree. Whereas water, you take some, you add some more to it, you just have a bigger bit of water, right? So water you can just sort of pile up and heap up, and it's just the same thing. Or you can cut it up into smaller things. Same with earth, same with air. So these things that are the elements of living things are in a kind of more primitive or more basic form of natural existence that is not itself alive and is therefore not itself individuated, but it remains something that has a nature, in the sense that it has its characteristic ways of behaving or responding and so on. Anyway, so now from that whole domain of nature, we are going to look specifically at the things that are alive. And so that first cause of motion in the thing, that is the thing's nature, we're going to now talk about that in living things, and that's what we're going to give the name soul. So let's go on now and talk a little bit about the work on the soul. So he begins book 2 of On the Soul, pretty much where we just left off from that stuff from the physics. So he says, we're in the habit of, well, man, this translation really adds a lot of words to what Aristotle actually said. But anyway, he says, we're in the habit of recognizing as one determinate kind of thing that is substance, and that in several senses. A, in the sense of matter, or that which is not in itself of this. B, in the sense of form, which is precisely that in virtue of which a thing is called a this. And thirdly, in the sense of that which is compounded of both A and B. That's all overall okay except C. That's a terrible translation, in the sense of that which is compounded out of both A and B. Aristotle says, and third, that out of these. So the reason I say it's such a terrible translation is because the English word compound, which is what this translator has added, has so much resonance, and it precisely gives you the wrong impression. So Aristotle say, sometimes we talk about things in terms of, the matter. Sometimes we talk about them in terms of the form, and we've already seen what that means, right? So you can talk about the person as this human individual, or you can talk about the person as the limbs and the circulatory system and whatever. You're talking about the same reality, but you're naming it once in terms of its existence as a this individual, and you're talking about it once in terms of the out of which, right? The what you could call the material conditions of its existence, the material forms of its realization, something like that. But yeah, so we've already been saying that. And he said, but if we ask, what is the substance? And substance, meaning the real existent reality. The reality. What is the reality of it? Well, this is real, and the stuff out of which is real. So when you were talking about the me or the circulatory system, you certainly were talking about real things. But in each case, you were talking about a reality that is itself a kind of an aspect of something else that is more profoundly the real thing, right? And that is what he's saying, that out of these two, right? In other words, he's saying the real reality, and this is again just what we already said when we were talking about physis in Physics Book 2, Chapter 1. The real reality is that living natural existent that can be looked at in terms of the this that it is, what it is, the form. It can be looked at in terms of the out of which. Right? Both of those things are real and true, but the most fundamental reality is the living thing. And that's what this translator is poorly rendering as the compound of the two. It's not a compound because they're not two separate things that are put together. It's actually quite the opposite of that. There's one thing, and we separate out two different ways of apprehending it. We're not wrong to do so, but the reality is the non-separability of those things. So it's absolutely not a compound. It's on the contrary, the founding or pre-existent reality out of which we could separate by distinguishing these two different aspects. Anyway, but he says now with respect to that, he says, well, so we have, we talked about the matter and the form and then the real living thing, right? He says, now matter is potentiality, form actuality, and of the latter there are two grades related to one each other. Again, translation here is poor. He says, as for example, knowledge to the exercise of knowledge. Well, actually what he says is as science to contemplation, as episteme to theorein. And knowledge and the exercise of knowledge is not actually correct. It's it's in the ballpark. But so just put that on hold. But let's look just at the first part of the sentence. He says, matter is potentiality, form, actuality. So he's just said we're going to distinguish the matter, the form, and then we're going to look at the thing, the real thing that is formed matter or materialized form, that exists in individual, that is the reality about which we would say its form or its matter. He says, well, the matter is we would call potentiality. So what do we mean by that? Well, it means that, I referred to material conditions. Having let's just take the ear. I think the ear is a good example. Having whatever, the cochlea and whatever, the canal, all these bits. You can't have an ear without those bits. Those constituent elements of the material body that is the sense organ are the conditions that have to be met if a person is going to have the capacity to hear. Right? So those, or similarly, if a person is going to have the capacity to grab, that person is going to have fingers, a palm, and an opposable thumb. If you don't have that opposable thumb, if you don't have these things differentiated and going together like this, you can't grab. So fingers, thumb, and palm are the material conditions of grabbing. They're the material conditions that would have to be met if the ability to grab is going to exist. So in that sense, they are what offer the potentiality of grabbing. Without them, you don't have the potential to grab, and that's why a cat can't grab. It doesn't have the matter, the material conditions that are the material conditions necessary for that act to be realized. Right. So in that sense, as he says, matter is potentiality, and he says form actuality. Well, okay, what's actually happening here is grabbing. That's what's really happening. So grabbing only happens as fingers and thumbs coming together. But the essence of that activity is to grab. So, but what we mean when we talk about the form is we mean we're naming what the thing actually is. We're naming the essence or the very meaning of that act. It is to grab. That is the actuality we're talking about. That is the actual thing we're after. What is it to grab? And if you define to grab, you would say its meaning is something like to secure possession of an object or something like that. Like you wouldn't in defining it, in defining the activity, the definition, what it means to grab, wouldn't refer to fingers and thumbs. You would say finger and thumb is how you are able to do that thing you said. Or, you could similarly say, what is it to hear? It is the ability, while you're one person in one location, to know by effectively immediate encounter what another person said. Or, what a musical instrument, what sound a musical instrument made. That's what it is to hear. It is to have the actual experience of apprehending in a sensorially immediate way the sound or whatever it is that someone else in a different place put forth. Right? So that's how you would define it. But how does that happen? Well, it only happens if you have these particular parts that make up an ear. But again, you don't include them in the definition of what it is to hear, but they are the material conditions necessary for that activity to be realized. So matter is potentiality, form actuality. The matter of the actuality of my activity is to grab. The matter is fingers and opposable thumb. Or the actuality of my activity is to hear. The material conditions are all the ear parts. So matter is actuality, form actuality. But then he says of the latter there are two grades related to one another, as for example, knowledge and the exercise of knowledge. Let's ignore for a moment what I'm calling the poor translation there and just stick with what the translator said. Knowledge and the exercise of knowledge. Yeah, so like you could say, well, I have the ability to hear. I am actually a hearing being, but I'm not hearing anything at the moment. Or you can say, I actually am a grabbing being, but I'm not actually grabbing anything at the moment. So there are two senses of actuality. One is actuality in the sense of the possession of the capacity, to be defined by that capacity. The other is to actually exercise it. That's roughly what the translation says. He gives another example. He says it's compared to waking and sleeping. When you're asleep, all of those capacities of your normal cognitive experiencing life are still true of you. They still define you, but you're not actually awake. You're not actually doing it. So I think sleeping and waking is a pretty good model of the difference between being defined by that actuality, or having the actuality of being a grabbing, hearing being, but that power is kind of asleep, versus being awake when you're actually the stuff is actually happening. Anyway, so here's what he said. He said, we're in the habit of distinguishing these realities, matter, form, and the thing that is both of those. And then he says, okay, matter, we would commonly call that potential. Form, we would think of that as the actual, what is actual. But he says there's two kinds of actual. And that actual is to be distinguished between, that actual is, in the notion of actuality, there's a distinction between the basic definition of what something is and the real existing of that thing. Those three things we just marked out, matter, form, and the real substance, roughly correspond then to the potential in these two kinds of actuality. There is the material conditions are the potential for the thing. The form is the basic definition of the thing, what it is to be that thing. But the existingly real thing, that's the primary reality of which those about which those other two are kind of descriptions. So he says, okay, now we just want to take that distinction, which you could go back to our discussion about the tree and the physics and see it still fits there pretty straightforwardly. But now going back to the physics, of natural bodies, some have life in them, like plants and animals, but others do not, like the ocean, the water. What do we mean by life? Okay, so we're getting something new. By life, first of all, we mean self-nutrition and growth. We talked about growth a little bit before. I don't think I particularly talked about self-nutrition. It came up in passing. But, notice that that's the flip side of that process of growing is the process of that organism taking in from its surrounding environment the things it needs to grow, self-nutrition. And so then he says, so the soul is the definition of the soul. The soul is the first actuality in the first sense, the first grade of actuality of a natural body having life potentially in it. So now he's saying, how do we want to use the word soul? He's saying, okay, just go back to those things we've just said. We talked about the material conditions that make it possible for that thing to be the thing that it is. We've talked about kind of the definition of what that thing is. And then we've talked about the existing reality that is that thing. The second one, that basic definition of the thing, he says that's how we're going to use the word soul. So he says soul is the first grade of actuality, or actuality in that first sense we used with respect to a natural body. So he's going to use the word soul, in other words, just to refer to the what it is of a natural body. And the what it is, that's the same thing in the physics he called the form. So the soul is in that sense going to be the form, the defining reality of a natural body. But it's of a natural body having life potentially in it. So we could have just used that word. He's talking about the same thing he was talking about when he was talking about nature, but he's reserving he's reserving soul specifically for those natural bodies that are alive. Right? He said some natural bodies are alive, some aren't. Well, soul is the principle of nature in a living body. So now, what kind of body is a living body? Well, the body so described as a body which is organized. Right? So living beings, unlike that heap of stuff that is the water, the ocean, or that heap of earth that is the earth, or the heap of air that is the air, living bodies are living individuals. And they're living, that also means they can die. And when they're living, what we are as living beings is organisms, right? We have a multiplicity of differentiated bodily systems, parts, whatever else, that are integrated into the single reality of being that one body that lets the living thing live. So he says, this is true. So even if you look at a plant, he says the parts of plants, in spite of their extreme simplicity, are nonetheless organs. I mean, organ is a word that basically means tool. And so when we talk about your organs, what that basically means is the parts of you that are the tools, so to speak, carrying out the functions necessary for you to live. And so the parts of the plant, in spite of their extreme simplicity, are nonetheless organs. For example, the leaf serves to shelter the pericarp. The pericarp serves to shelter the fruit. I'm saying serves to emphasize this sort of functional tool-like characteristic. The roots of the plant are analogous to the mouth of animals, both of which serve for the taking in of food. So, again, if we were going to try to say, again, what do we mean by a soul? Well, we say it's that first kind of actuality, the kind that is the definition, as opposed to the actuality that is the actual existing of the thing. By the soul, we're talking about the what of the thing. It is the first grade of actuality of a natural, organized body. And he says, so for that reason, we can wholly dismiss as unnecessary the question whether the soul and the body are one. Because, of course they are. Because we are just talking about the body that is that living organism. And we're simply distinguishing the multiplicity that is the differentiated system of bodily parts that perform essential functions from the unitary definition of the organizing principle of that whole thing. And so he says, he goes on, and then he gives those very examples I gave. He said, so what if we took an artificial thing, which of course wouldn't be a great example, but if we started from that and said, what's the soul of an axe? It would be to cut, right? So go back to what I said about to grab with the hand. The axe would be to cut. That would define the what of it. And if we asked about the eye, it's the soul of an eye, if it could have one, would be to see. Because that is the function that defines the reality of that thing. So when it's actually living, it's seeing. And that living reality of the eye is defined as to see, and it's realized as the different eye parts, the rods and cones and whatever else there is in eyes. Retina, cornea, all that sort of stuff. In all of those cases, if you think of the eye, like it's not like one thing is the to see and another thing is the parts. No, the reality of the power to see is a body organized in this way that is animated throughout by that natural capacity to realize that function. And so he says, therefore, from this it indubitably follows that the soul is inseparable from its body. So all we've done there is taken the same point we made in our study of the physics, or brief discussion of the physics, and brought it to bear on living things. And in doing that, we brought out a few things. We looked at what that relationship of body and soul, or matter and form, is in the living being, and we distinguished them as the potentiality of a thing and the actuality of a thing. We noticed that there were two different kinds of actuality: the actuality that is the definition of what the thing is, and the actuality that is the actual existing of it. And we're focusing on that, the what it is. And we then looked at that in relationship to the living thing and noticed that the living being has an organized body, and that the soul then is its defining essence, and it's basically naming how that organized body is a unity. Again, that's a living thing. When it dies, you can really catch on to that if you think about what happens when a living thing isn't living anymore. When a living thing dies, that body isn't a body anymore. It's no longer the potential for living, and the eye is no longer the potential for seeing. It's now a bunch of different bodies that are temporarily fused together, but they'll pretty quickly come apart. Right, as your body will just sit there and rot. And these things, which used to be the organized, integrated fabric of a single existing reality. They were just the living presence of this living individual, are now a whole bunch of different bodies that are all going to operate on different principles of still natural of their own. But those things that made up your eye are no longer defined by the to see. They're now they're not eye parts anymore. They were, but now they're just other kinds of bodies, and they will do whatever those disintegrated parts will do. Which is largely going to be rot. And so the a body, a living body, is all of those things held together as the single fabric making possible a single functioning. When you die, there is no longer a single body there, and there is no longer a single fabric and a single functioning, right? And with that thing we call a corpse is something that was an organized body, but has now become, to use the word that I said was poorly used in this translation, has now become a compound. It's just become things that are put together, but they have no reason to be together anymore, and they will come apart. They will disintegrate. So the soul and the body are one in the sense that as soon as that is not defined by the to live of the organism anymore, it's not even a body anymore, right? It's not a body. Okay, so let's take that as our quick discussion of Book 2, Chapter 1 of On the Soul, just taking that notion of nature and moving it a little bit into talking about living things and specifying a little bit more fully how to think about a living organism using those notions of motion and matter and form that came out of the physics, adding these notions of potential and actual, and so on, right? And so we now have this definition. The soul is the first actuality of an organized natural body. I hope that sentence, if you think through it slowly, means something to you. I now just want to quickly make one more point about the souls of living things, and that's to look at some of the different powers of soul. But before that, I want to just go back to the thing we were just saying, and just make sure you have one thing clearly in your mind, right? You have the power to grab in your hand, and so to grab, on the one hand, is what the hand is about, right? So that really is the essence of the hand. So in other words, you have to appeal to that to make sense of what this is. And that's why you have fingers and a thumb. They are organs in that they are the means for allowing this kind of life form to realize that kind of function it needs to realize. So you have a heart to facilitate the circulation of the blood that's necessary for the transfer of oxygen and all that other stuff. Calling them organs is to say those things that are your body parts have as their reality, insofar as they are parts of a living body. Right? Once you're dead, they have different bodily meaning and different bodily reality. But insofar as they are a body of a living being, their reality is to be organs. It is to serve the defining needs of that organism, which is to say they are there for the sake of realizing those functions. The parts of the ear are for hearing. Fingers and the thumb are for grasping. So in a living being, causality, so to speak, is top down, right? It's from the meaning of that life form that the terms of the bodily reality come. Right? Once you're dead, that's not true. Once you're dead, those things that were given their meaning by their subordination to serving a role in fulfilling that function take on a new meaning, and they are disintegrated, and they'll go through a different set of still natural activities, but very different ones, because there's no life there anymore. But while you are alive, your body means essentially the organ of your form. So the thing I'm trying to get at there is in a strong sense the idea that what he's calling the soul, the form, the defining form of a living body, is a cause. It's not a cause in the sense of an alien thing that comes around doing something. It's a cause in the sense of being we're naming what the real originative source of what you are is. We're naming that which is the real thing that's, what is going on here. And therefore, it's the real thing that's causing what you're seeing, both at the sense of causing why a body of this makeup is coming into existence, and also defining why these teeth are moving and this stuff is being swallowed and all the rest, right? So both at the level of the formative activity of the generation of the natural body and at the level of the ongoing activities of the life process, what you are is why those things are happening. So I'm trying to bring out, he said at the beginning we were talking about realities. We're talking about the substantial realities. I'm trying to bring out that really meaningful sense in which what he's calling the soul is a substance. It's not a substance in the sense of being some kind of ghost or some other thing. It's the substance in the sense of being the real thing that is happening here, that is why all the material changes you're seeing are taking place. Anyway, so then he says, okay, well, so what are these kinds of functions? What kinds of soul are there? What are the functions of soul? And he comes up. Through chapter 2, he talks about a few different things, a few of them, and then at the beginning of chapter 3 of book 2, he sort of summarizes them, and he says, of the psychic powers above enumerated, some kinds of living things, as we have said, possess all, some less than all, others one only. Let me just underline that word, psychic powers, right? These powers that are the existent reality of living things, in as much as they are alive, which is to say, in as much as they have souls, or ensouled. Anyway, those we have mentioned are the nutritive, the appetitive, having an appetite, a desire for something, the sensory, the locomotive, right, the ability to move to different places, and the power of thinking. So I want you to hold on to those 5: the nutritive, the appetitive, the sensory, and the locomotive, and the thinking. Because those basically mark out the most significant distinctions in the natural world, and they're actually pretty important. The nutritive power, that is the defining power in plants, right? What it is to be a plant, that's just another way of saying, if you say something is a plant, you're saying you are the existence in the world of a life process whereby some kind of thing brings itself into being as a process of growth that comes about through self-nutrition. Right? A plant is the way some body, initially a seed, some body is dynamic. It doesn't just sit there. It interacts with what's around it from the start. There's no on-off switch. It only exists as an ongoing process of interaction. And that process of interaction is the process. It's not passive. It's not just being pushed around. It is the process of it interacting with its environment to transform its original circumstances into the situation of a green stalk coming up, or whatever it is, right? It is the process of bringing it about that a rose comes into being, or bringing it about that lavender comes into being, whatever kind of plant we're talking about. And there are types of plants. There are plant species, to go back to that word, plant forms. There are lavender plants, tomato plants, orange plants, whatever else, maple, right? You take one of those seeds and it's like, we're going to make maple, we're going to make tomato, right? And from the start, that seed was defined by the reality that it's going to bring that thing into being. And that little seed, weird little piece of body surrounded with dirt and water kind of magically transforms those material things into some new material things that gradually become a whole maple tree. Right? That is self-nutrition and growth. The plant doesn't do anything else except go through the process of taking in nutriment and transforming it from, what began as dirt and water, transforms that into maple fabric or lavender fabric, right? It interacts with an alien environment to turn what was alien into itself. But turning it into itself is even there. It's kind of a funny notion because it's actually making itself come into being. Like it's turning dirt into the body of a maple tree that didn't exist before. There was a seed before, but new stuff is going to happen, and that's going to be the maple tree. But that's the process of self-nutrition. Nutrition in the sense of taking in something alien and making it part of yourself. Self-nutrition in the sense that it does it itself. Its process is the process of feeding. And that process of feeding is also the process of growing into its own reality. So that's the kind of soul, to use Aristotle's language, that is what a plant is. Plants they just are processes of self-nutrition. There's nothing else to say about them. That's exactly what a plant is. Different plants are realizing different definitions of self, but that's what a plant is. It is the definition of maple bringing itself into being in the natural world. It is the definition of lavender bringing itself into being in the natural world. And it takes place in the context of one body surrounded by other bodies making that thing happen. And if you kill that seed, then it's going to stop, right? There's nothing about the simple presence of some material elements side by side each other that make it happen. It's not the side by side. It's that the seed is that body already sort of energized, already defined by to grow into maple that is a seed, and then put it in the ground, and it will go through the process of self-nutrition, and in so doing, it will realize the maple reality, the lavender reality, whatever it is. So that's roughly what nutrition is. And he studies that in more detail in Book 2, Chapter 4. But he's named it here. But then he names three more. The appetitive, having desires, right? That plant doesn't have any desires, because desires, we use that word to mean something like some kind of awareness that you want. Plant doesn't have awareness. It has behavioral responsiveness. Its body is defined by a trajectory, but it doesn't feel that or know that. It just acts. Acts is even too strong a word. Its function comes out of that, right? But animals, feel things. They get hungry, right? They get thirsty. They get sleepy, right? So the appetitive is the name for actually having the experience that there's something basically outside you, something you don't currently have that you want. So it's the appetitive power. That's a certain characteristic of a certain kind of living thing. Sensory power, that's another one. That's the ability to recognize things that are outside you, while maintaining it means awareness most basically, but it means while maintaining that awareness, to be able to recognize what's outside you. Right? Think about nutrition. Nutrition, you got this plant growing and there's a thing outside it. It interacts meaningfully with what's outside it. But that interaction just is the obliteration of the alienness of that and the turning of it into oneself. Sensation is a little different. Well, it's a lot different. Sensation, you are there and you're aware of the thing outside you. You're encountering the alien thing, but in a sense, you've taken that thing into yourself, in that you've brought it into your awareness, right? You brought it into your consciousness, so to speak, but you left it untouched, right? So sensation is this interesting way of being meaningfully struck by and responsive to what's outside you, but in a way that doesn't touch or doesn't, well, I guess you can literally touch something and sense it, but it doesn't transform it. It leaves it in its own condition, even as there was a meaningful interaction between you, right? But anyways, we may get more into those details later. Probably not though. But I want you just to think about sensation, or your perception might even be a better word than sensation. Plants don't perceive. They have a kind of behavioral responsiveness, but they don't have an awareness that they're seeing something. Again, they have a behavioral responsiveness to what's outside, but they don't have an awareness that they're hungry, right? So appetite is that kind of awareness turned on your own condition. Sensation is a kind of awareness turned on what's outside you, right? There's the second power, the sensory. And then the third one he mentioned, the second of this list of three I'm talking about, the third one of that list of three is the locomotive, right? And that is the ability to move yourself around, right? So those three effectively define the psychic reality of animals, what it is to be an animal. So there are certain animals, pretty primitive ones that may not have all of those functions. That's interesting, and in the long run, biologically and philosophically, very important. But for our purposes, not particularly important. We'll think about animals like tigers and horses and dogs, the things you regularly encounter. The thing you notice about all of them is that they want they're hungry. They sense what's around them and they can move. Pretty striking in the case of the tiger. The tiger's hungry, sees a gazelle and runs and gets it, right? And you can see that appetite, the perception, and the ability of locomotion are all part of this basic thing that lets that tiger life form exist. But I just want to name that here as the appetitive, the sensory, and the locomotive as the sort of three axes of the defining reality of an animal soul. So self-nutrition, or self-nutrition and growth, or even self-nutrition, reproduction and growth, different times in writing about this, he mentions all three of those and brings them out in relationship to each other, showing that they're all more or less they are basically all the same function looked at in different angles. So self-nutrition, growth, and reproduction, that's the thing that makes a plant a plant. The thing that makes an animal, where the powers are appetite, perception, and locomotion. But it's also true that animals eat. So the self-nutrition, reproduction, and growth that characterize plants also characterize animals. But whereas they are the defining powers of a plant and what make a plant be a plant, they are in an animal there, but subordinated to some more basic reality, which is the particular reality of the animal that is only realized through its appetite, perception, and motion. And then the last one, though, is the power of thinking. So the thing about you and me and our friends is that we can think as well. We eat like a plant. We can sense, desire, and move like other animals. In that sense, we are animals, but there's something else about us that is not present in other beings as far as we know. And that is what he's calling here the power of thinking. And, he means some pretty specific things by that. I'm not going to dwell on the specifics now. I might speak about them later. And we have talked about them already in talking about Plato. We've talked about pretty similar things. But I just want to just stick to that word in a very loose sense, without worrying about the details of it. The point is, we do have that... the capacity for knowledge, right? The capacity to go beyond being able sort of intelligently to respond to how we're going to get food out of our immediate surrounding circumstances, which the tiger or the horse or the dog can do. But we can actually ask about the world. What is a horse? What is a plant? What is nature? And we can entertain the what is question. And that's roughly what we mean by thinking about it. And when you ask what is a gazelle, let's say, you are asking about the reality of that sort of on its own terms. You're not asking about that in terms of how it might be of interest to you. Whereas the tiger recognizes a gazelle, but it doesn't recognize it the way a biologist does. It recognizes it as food. Right? It recognizes it in terms of how it fits into the life needs of the tiger. But that's not what the biologist is doing, the zoologist, in thinking about the gazelle. Right there is a kind of detachment of the cognitive process from the needs of life to ask about this thing in its own right, to just ask about the reality of it. And that takes us back to our theme from the pre-Socratics about just the question of reality as such and the ability to entertain the notion of the real. Well, anyway, but so all that stuff we've talked about, like that's basically what we're getting at with thinking. And so when we reflect on the nature of soul and on the natural world, we're really going to recognize within the realm of living things, right? There's more to nature than just life, but within the realm of living things, we're really going to recognize a distinction between plants and animals and people. And that distinction isn't an arbitrary decision about how to cut up the stuff around you. That is a recognition of the way the natural world distinguishes things, in as much as that is the recognition of fundamentally different functions of living. And it's the distinction between the nutritive power, where that is basically the only psychic function a certain kind of living individual exhibits. The differentiation between that and another kind of life form that still exhibits the nutritive power, but exhibits it in a way that is no longer defining of that organism, but is subordinated to another set of functions that are definitive of how that organism can realize its distinctive life form. And those are three that are typically, although not always, but typically integrated: the appetitive, the sensory, and the locomotive. And then, but in addition to that, we notice a very weird other thing in the natural world. We notice this other thing ourselves that, with respect to the things we've just said, is essentially part of the animal world. But within us, there is another function, and it's the function of thinking. It again is fulfilled very differently, and it has a distinctive relationship to our identity, such that once again the perceptual, motor, and appetitive functions are kind of subordinated to that life defined by the power of thinking, analogously to the way that nutrition is subordinated to the life of appetite, perception, and motion in the animal. So as in the second chorus of Antigone, once again, by rigorously looking at the psychological functions that are definitive of the forms of natural life, we can start to see pretty powerfully the way the human being, in some sense, is clearly a part of nature, but has this other thing about it that differentiates it from other things in nature. And we're going to, as we have before, we're going to go on to investigate the human being and see what the implications of that are for understanding our own reality and our relationship to nature. So I'm going to leave it there. That's our introduction to the notion of nature and soul. And we're going to go on to talk about the human being in terms of the human being's capacities, but then especially to look at what it takes for a human being to live a human life. So we'll go on to that stuff next.